going to win 4 more years in that very beautiful, beautiful, beautiful house. It's called the White House.
He was not a loser. It's time to stand up and take back our democracy. We can do this. We can be better than what we've been. We can be who we are at our best. The United States of America.
Final hours, anxious wait. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to a special edition of the France 24 debate. It's the world's most powerful nation taking a big test. With this election taking place in the midst of a pandemic, with a record early vote count and all sorts of questions over what happens when the polls have closed later on. Over the next hour, we're going to be taking a look at what's exactly at stake. And joining us first is France 24 Washington correspondent Ketevan Gorgistani. Before we talk about what's happening at the polls, tell us about the 2 candidates on this election day.
Well, final day for them. It was an early start for the President of the United States. He had an interview on Fox News, and then he headed to the Republican National Committee, the headquarters in Virginia, to speak to those campaign workers helping him out on this final day. For Joe Biden, it was also an early start. He started out going to church in his home state of Delaware. He actually went where his son Beau is buried, because he said that on every big day for him, he likes to visit his son's burial site. So that's how he started. But then he went to the all-important battleground state of Pennsylvania. Well, he's been speaking to voters, trying to get those final people who have yet to cast their ballot to actually turn up to the polls, because he knows, especially in Pennsylvania, all of these votes will count.
Yeah, undecided voters, a rare species in this election. And I guess the word of the day, Ketevan, is anxiety. And we heard it from polling officials that we saw in Maryland bright and early. They weren't worried about the process today. They're worried about what happens when the polls close. And walking over here, and we're just in front of the White House, I got to say, it is a shock when you compare. We were at this position 4 years ago to see you can't see it on TV, but this barricade that's downstairs in front of the White House, and those barricades even getting longer in the last 24 to 48 hours.
Well, they've been getting gradually higher and bigger throughout the past few months that I've seen here. And of course, these past few hours, they've really reinforced those barricades around Lafayette Square. But it's true of the rest of the city. Also, stores boarding up their storefronts. It's true of other big cities, Philadelphia, New York, LA, all of that, because people are just really anxious, because the country is so divided, because there's so many questions about will all the votes be counted? Can we trust this electoral system? The president, of course, has not really helped that anxiety, because he has used that for months now to put into question this election, the election integrity, the mail-in ballots, all of that. And so you have a sense of people preparing for the worst, but hoping for the best, which is getting results that are clear and not waiting too long for those results.
Not waiting too long, and that's where the trouble could start, because we won't have a winner on election night. Let me ask you, it's called Election Day, but I guess we could call it Election Week. That's how it felt for the people, again, we went to see in polling stations earlier, the sense that, well, there aren't many more people voting today than there have been, for instance, in Maryland, where the voting started a week ago Monday.
Yeah, I could even say it's election months, because some early voting in person started in different states all the way back in September. So people have been voting for a long time now, and especially in the DMV area, Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., a lot of people took advantage of early voting in person, of mail-in ballots, and you see in a lot of states that you have a lot of people who have voted. 100 million Americans have already voted. So this election day is is really to see how big of a turnout it will be. It's already looking like it's going to be big. Will it break the records? That's what we have to see. But remember, at least 6 states have already, just in early and mail-in ballots, have already surpassed their total number of ballots cast back in 2016. So it shows that people are excited about this election. They want to vote, and they're taking every option to vote.
Are you like me, Kedevan, oscillating every 10 minutes between thinking that, yeah, there is reason to be anxious and thinking, well, it's the United States, and when we see most people exercising their civic duty in a responsible manner, it's going to be okay?
Well, it is a balance because we keep seeing things that are positive, others that are a little bit negative. But I feel like this wave of people voting does give some hope, and probably it will all come down to how clear the results are one way or another, and how quickly we get those very important and decisive states, and how we know for a fact who has won.
All right, Kedevan Gorjestani, it's going to be, what do you call it, a long night or a short night for you?
Short night.
Short night, all right. Well, Godspeed to you. Kedevan Gorjestani, France 24 Washington correspondent. And yeah, on that issue of what this surge in early voting means and what it means when the ballots are actually counted, let's cross over to Gavin Thompson-Wise. He's the election data manager at the U.S. Vote Foundation. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. What are you hearing in terms of how it's going around the country so far?
Thank you for having me. What I'm hearing is pretty similar to what you're hearing, that through the early vote and through the mail-in absentee ballots, we are looking at really possibly higher than ever before turnout, certainly in that phase of voting, and we could be looking at what could be a 100-year turnout, as some are saying now. How many we will see today on Election Day, that's the big question, I think, that we're all waiting to find out.
All waiting to find out how big a turnout it actually is. And the caricature we've heard is that the Democrats like to vote early and the Republicans like to vote on the day. Is that what your numbers find?
I think that's the prevailing wisdom. However, there's a number of notable exceptions to that as well. But if that does hold true, I think that's where you're going to see some interesting things with regards to the results, for example. When some of the early results are released after the close of polls tonight, I think 7, 8 o'clock on some of these states like Florida, North Carolina, etc., they will be reporting on the early voting totals right away, and those mail ballot totals right away, because they have the permission to count them earlier. So in that respect, I think we'll see, if that theory holds true, we could see Democrats with a little bit of an edge, and that number may go down over the evening as the election day returns come in. Now, the opposite may be true in a state like Pennsylvania, which doesn't have the ability to count early. So we may see the opposite hold true there. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Have to wait and see. And do you get, have you ever dealt with anything like this before? What does it tell you? 100 million people have already voted. What does it tell you when it comes to how those ballots will be counted? We've seen challenges in lots of areas, in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Texas, Wisconsin. Is this going to play out for days, weeks, months?
It very well could. I think that it really depends on what happens, again, with those early states that close. If we see that there perhaps isn't a path to the presidency for the current president, as some have predicted, then we will see a lot of this pressure for counting those other ballots in some of those other states that come in later. A lot of that pressure will just disappear. However, if the presidency is very much still in question after some of those early states come in, then, as it goes days and days, that's when, we will see that pressure applied. And that's when it will become, I don't want to say another Florida 2000, but, it will be a sort of uncharted territory in this country, for sure.
Gavin Thompson-Wise, I guess, forgive us for trying to read the tea leaves here. We're seeing in some of those key swing states, people have voted, it's variable just to how much they've voted early. I'm looking at Pennsylvania, 40% of registered voters, if I'm correct, and places like Michigan and Ohio, 60%. Does that say anything about the way the actual vote is going to go?
I mean, we would have to assume that it's the same electorate voting. It's just people are choosing to cast their ballots in a different way. For example, in Pennsylvania, the option to cast votes by mail wasn't really there in the same manner as it is this year. So that's why you see such high numbers. In other states like Florida, they had a tradition of voting by mail. So I think that this is just telling you that people, I think, made up their minds much earlier this year. I think it's also telling you that people were a little uncertain about how they would be able to cast a vote on Election Day. With all of the COVID-19 restrictions and what have you, would they be able to just go to their regular polling station like normal and cast a ballot? And would they feel safe doing it? And because of that, together with maybe an electorate that largely did, make up its mind pretty early this election, it caused a lot of people to just simply vote early. And that's why we see such high numbers across the board.
And again, there's that big difference between those who went to early voting centers or to drop boxes or who sent their ballots through the post. And, well, there are questions, particularly with those mail-in ballots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, voters had a number of ways to cast their ballots, as you just mentioned, and there is some questions about those who cast them via the Postal Service. There are reports that the Postal Service was maybe a bit slower this year, especially during the last week. And there is a question of whether or not ballots in some states postmarked by Election Day, will be counted after. In many states, in several states, there are provisions, in some up to, I think, California, maybe 17 days or so. They can arrive as long as they're postmarked on the day. In others, like Pennsylvania, they've just changed the law to allow votes to come in up to Friday, as long as they were postmarked today. However, as you may have heard on the news, the Supreme Court has sort of left the room open for, they did not rule on that, basically. So we have to see what will happen, and whether or not that will be challenged. And as I understand, election officials in Pennsylvania are keeping those ballots separate, and they will count them, but they will keep them separate just because they are not certain at this point what ultimately may be decided through the courts.
Yeah, the fact that it's not one race but 50 races in the United States, well, 51 if you count the District of Columbia, for people from around the world, it's something that's a little bit difficult to get their head around. So the question is, these accusations of voter suppression, of making it harder or easier to vote depending on which way the pendulum is swinging politically, is it worse than in the past?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me take the first part of the question. Yes, it definitely is 51, if you will, or even more if we look at the number of counties and jurisdictions across the different 50 states. Because those counties and jurisdictions also have their own ways of conducting elections as long as they comply with the general state guidelines. So it's quite a different a mosaic, as we say, in order to come up with results, especially when they're coming up to one unified election as the presidential election, which is essentially the amalgamation across the states. As to whether it's worse this year in terms of some of this voter suppression, I mean, that's hard to say. I would say that there's the one positive I'm taking from all of this is that, despite some issues you see with the rulings on prison voting and things like that, the one positive is that with the early voting options being expanded in many states, there has been really a better opportunity to cast your ballot early and by mail than there ever has been before. So that's why I do think you will see a record turnout, and I'm hoping by giving voters those opportunities to vote that we will see, participation like we haven't seen in our lifetimes.
Gavin Thompson-Wise of the U.S. Vote Foundation, thank you so much for speaking with us here on France 24. One of those bellwether states that we're going to be keeping a close eye on throughout is Florida. Let's cross to Miami Beach. And France 24's Clovis Casali, what's the latest?
Well, it's rather quiet here at Miami Beach City Hall. There are people coming, of course, to vote, but no queues. It's quite surprising because on my left, you've got a very long queue of people, but they're testing for COVID-19. So quite a different issue, of course. Here, of course, battleground state, Florida, hugely important for Donald Trump. Florida, special in the heart of the incumbent U.S. president. His wife, Melania Trump, the First Lady, voted this morning in Palm Beach County. Worth pointing out, she was the only one not wearing a mask. This area, Miami, is traditionally blue, but of course other parts of Florida are mostly Republican. Donald Trump wants to win this state. It's an important state for him as he tries to clinch that magic number, 270 electoral votes, of course. So rather quiet here in Miami Beach, but that can be explained, of course, by the unprecedented levels, you were talking about it, of early voting. People who voted either by mail or in person, but before today. So that's the situation currently here in Miami Beach, and there are queues of people in other parts, of course, of Florida, people turning up to vote. The election, of course, here in Florida has been in all minds, and some people have been telling us that they do fear that violence could erupt later in the day. I spoke to one Republican supporter who came here today to vote, who told me he wanted to vote in person because he was worried that the election could be rigged, that that a ballot by mail could be ignored, there could be irregularities, and of course that's what President Donald Trump has been saying all along. He said it again Sunday at a rally, a late-night rally here in Miami. He said that some people would try to benefit from irregularities and that he would not allow that, and his supporters here seem to be convinced by that argument.
Clovis Casali reporting live from Miami Beach in Florida, where the polls are open until later on. Let's now turn to Grover Norquist, who's president of Americans for Tax Reform, and who has been, in the past, one of the ones who you could say shaped the agenda inside of the Republican Party. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. All right, we'll try to cross over to Grover Norquist as soon as we can. Try to cross over there to Grover Norquist. In the meantime, let's give you an update on the situation as well in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, where is one of those areas in that other battleground state, Pennsylvania, that will be key when it comes to whether or not Donald Trump can retain the White House. France 24's Florence Villeminot joins us. Florence, tell us where you are.
Hey, Francois. Yeah, we're in front of a polling station in West Philadelphia. Not too many people voting right now, but apparently this morning there were lines around the block, people eager to get their vote in. We were here last night speaking to a lot of voters. Must be said, all the voters we spoke to were going to vote for Joe Biden because that's one of the characteristics of Pennsylvania is there is a big divide between big cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party, and then more rural areas that vote for Donald Trump. Now, Pennsylvania is really what a key state in this election. It's known as the Keystone State, and people are saying it could be the keystone in this election. There are 20 electoral college votes up for grabs. It's going to be a tight race. Both candidates have been campaigning heavily in this battleground state for weeks now, and indeed in the final days. Both candidates held rallies yesterday. Joe Biden got some star power. He was campaigning with Lady Gaga in Pittsburgh. Donald Trump, meanwhile, he actually went to Scranton, which is Joe Biden's hometown. So maybe a little jab there at his rival. And so both candidates know that Pennsylvania is key in in this election. Trump himself has said that we win Pennsylvania, we win the whole thing. There's been a lot of early voting here in Pennsylvania, people mailing in ballots here as in other parts of the U.S. as well. About 40% of people have already cast their ballot. So massive turnout here. And here at this polling station in West Philadelphia, the people we spoke to are expecting more people to come and vote around lunchtime. And then certainly this evening after 5 p.m., there should be a rush of voters here in West Philadelphia.
Florence Villeminot reporting live. We'll be checking back in with you throughout as well. And since the ballot counting began there in Pennsylvania on the day, it is going to be a long wait where you are. Let's cross back now to Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform. Thank you so much for speaking with us here on France 24. The potential for a record turnout, what does that tell you?
Well, it's very helpful. People have been excited about both races, but the Trump people have been pushing a lot of energy into getting out the vote on this day, today. They've had much more of a ground game to get out the vote at a time during COVID where the Democrats didn't go door to door, the Republicans did. And so their goal now is to get everybody that they've been talking to, getting them to vote early if they could, but they now know exactly who has voted, who hasn't voted, who intends to vote for President Trump, and they're getting them to the polls. So this is where all that work and the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to ID your supporters, to find out who they are and where they are, comes into play. And the polls are, trending up a little bit towards the end, but it's really a question of getting out your vote. And the Trump people feel they do know where they are, and that if they get the level of turnout that they hope to get, that they plan to get, that they win. If they don't have as much turnout, then it'll be tougher for them in Pennsylvania and elsewhere.
Yeah, 4 years ago, of course, we all remember what a shocker it was, how the polls got it wrong. You talk about the need to bring out those that to energize those that do support the incumbent and vote for Donald Trump. What does that tell you about America, the fact that this election has not been about convincing undecided voters? It's just been about trying to get your own side to the polls.
Well, you certainly have a lot of people who know the president, and there are people who like him, and there are people who don't like him. And then there are people in the middle. There just aren't that many. That I remember during the polls showed towards the end, there were about 7% who hadn't made up their mind between the president and Hillary. And of the people who didn't like either, the ones who didn't like Hillary more were about 2 points larger. So you're really trying to slice and dice the electorate. You want to bring out people who may not be crazy about you, but if they don't like the other guy, then you bring them out. So you get the people who want to vote for you because of party loyalty, want to vote for you because of some particular issue. And there are a lot of, not just the party and the campaign, there are issue groups. The pro-life groups have gone out and identified their voters, and they bring them to the polls. The people who care about the Second Amendment, opposition to gun control, have ID'd their voters, and they want to bring them to the polls as well. So they're different, and organized labor brings labor union folks for the Democrats. There are many, many turnout organizations, not just the campaign, not just the party, but also other campaigns. Senate campaigns have their own turnout. State legislators have their own turnout as well.
Yeah, it's not one race, it's several. You're right to point that out, Grover Norquist. Let's contemplate what you don't want to hear, which is Donald Trump losing. Now, this isn't the kind of Republican Party that you espoused. You're one of those who got legislators back in 2012 to sign this fiscal purity test. And fiscal purity in this pandemic seems to have gone out the window. Actually, it went out the window long before, it seems, there was a COVID pandemic. And so the question is, if Donald Trump loses, do you go back to the Republican Party that was fiscally conservative, or will it be Trump's party for a long time?
Well, there are two things. The pledge that I offer to all candidates, starting back in 1985 when I worked with President Reagan to create Americans for Tax Reform, is a pledge to never raise taxes. Once somebody has made that commitment, about 90% of Republicans make that commitment, you then have to say, okay, what do you do to restrain the cost of government, to reform government so it costs less? Until you take tax increases off the table, there's no discussion of budget restraint. What it will take to reform the serious growth in government spending is to reform entitlements, those things that are on automatic pilot that don't require a vote of Congress every year to keep spending money. We were within a whisper of getting that done this last year, but we lost the Republican Senate seat that we expected in Alabama, and we weren't able to do that. We got to go back, get a House, Senate, and a president, and then do for the welfare programs what Clinton did for aid to families with dependent children welfare. You take those entitlements, send them to 50 states. Say, here's the money you get. It's going to go up with inflation, but not more.
Right.
And you manage it in Wisconsin or California and Florida. That's the only way to deal with the big dollar numbers. It's always important to cut the small spending problems, but the big dollars are in entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
But you have a U.S. president who's blown up the budget deficit, and the Republican Party has followed him. And so the question, again, it's whether or not you can go back to what you've just described, all the different ways in which you can be fiscally conservative. Are those days long over? Has the Republican Party changed for good?
No, absolutely not. This is the Republican Party remains the party that will spend less than the Democrats on every issue except defense, but defense is only 3 to 4% of GDP, and the federal government's 20% of the economy. So outside of the 3 to 4% that's defense, the rest of it, the Democrats always want to spend more than the Republicans do. The question is, do you have the votes to make reforms that bring down the cost of government? And right now, with the narrow majority they had, they didn't have the vote for it. The president did have the stomach for it, which was interesting. I was surprised to learn that, but they just didn't have the votes at the end of the day.
And just one final question. Donald Trump, will he accept the verdict if he loses? Will he prematurely declare himself the winner? Will he wait until it's decisive who has won and who has lost?
Yeah, it's interesting to see the Democrats, the party of Al Gore, who refused to accept that he lost the election in 2000 and went on for months, that the nerve of the Democrats to say nobody should ever do that. Gore did that. And Hillary Clinton has made the comment, never concede, never concede, never concede. She didn't say don't concede prematurely in this last election. Her advice to Biden was never concede. So, look, there are going to be many things that come up. If there are problems with voting, it'll go to court, like in Florida, where there wasn't a problem with the voting, but the Democrats didn't like the voting. Turns out everything was fine. They just lost by 500 votes. We may have things like that come up, in which case you can go to court. At the end of the day, the state legislature makes the decision in each state as to who gets those electoral votes. So watch the state legislatures, watch the courts as well, because they can raise questions. But the state legislatures at the end of the day will be making that decision as to where those electoral votes go. And both Biden and Trump will want to make sure that they've exhausted all legal challenges if there's a problem they see in the voting.
All right, it's going to be perhaps a long process. I want to thank you so much, Grover Norquist, for joining us here on France 24. All right. Thank you so much for being with us. At this point in time here, if you're joining us live, we're in Washington. It's a special edition on Election Day. We're going to be welcomed by Sarah Rupert. Come on over, Sarah, who is, well, let's tell your story here a second, because it's an election taking place during a pandemic. And when the pandemic hit, where were you? Tell us.
I was in southern Morocco as a Peace Corps volunteer.
And from one day to the next?
We were evacuated, and just like that, I lost my job and was coming back to a country dealing with the pandemic.
Did it seem like a different country?
Yes. Yes.
How so?
Well, compared to 4 years ago, I felt very uncertain about what the future of the United States was going to be. We knew that we had the election coming up in November, and 4 years ago I was very confident, very cocky that Hillary Clinton was going to win. I felt very confident about what direction the country was going to go. Coming back in March, I was very uncertain.
Very uncertain. And do you still have that uncertainty today on election day? How do you feel?
I'm certainly more nervous today than I was 4 years ago. But I did wake up this morning feeling a little bit hopeful. Don't want to count my chickens before they're hatched. But I am feeling good about my generation. I think we're showing up in really good numbers.
Explain that to us, because, they're saying people are bragging on social media about, hey, I voted, something they didn't used to do in the past?
Yeah, very different from 4 years ago, where especially 4 years ago, I had a lot of friends that had been supporting Bernie Sanders that in 2016 were saying, well, I'm not going to vote, or I'm just going to write in Bernie Sanders. And this year, I think the conversation, at least among my circles, has very much shifted, where people that were not voting 4 years ago, that were supporting Bernie Sanders 4 years ago, are saying, you know what, we're settling for Biden. We can fight for more progressive policies later on, but right now the most important thing is to get Biden elected.
Are you able to find common ground with those who support Donald Trump of your age, or do you not speak to each other, or how does it work? I mean, are you able to talk to each other? Are you civil?
It's tricky. I actually have a number of family members that voted for Trump in the past election, and especially now in the pandemic, I'm not seeing them in person, but I am seeing what they're posting on social media. And so a lot of times there are not places that we have common ground, but especially with the Black Lives Matter movement in June, I had a number of cousins my age that voted for Donald Trump that were posting things on social media indicating actually that maybe they were for Black Lives Matter. And so there was a small shift for me that I was seeing on social media.
Did you ever imagine it would be this divisive?
No. It scares me actually how divisive it is. And I think a lot of people are not able to have conversations with people from the other side.
And one final question for you. You're posted to southern Morocco in the Peace Corps, and for people who don't know it, the Peace Corps is a VSN or volunteer service. You're in a way sort of a mini U.S. ambassador when you go abroad like that.
Right.
What do you feel about the way people perceive America now?
That's a great question. In Morocco, which is of course a Muslim country, a lot of my students, a lot of my friends, when they would ask me about America, the first thing that they would say is, oh, Donald Trump, he hates Muslims, he hates Muslim countries, and do all Americans hate Muslims? And so a lot of the conversations that I was having with my community were around those things, talking about my Muslim friends in America and the way that Muslims may or may not feel safe in the United States right now. And so, of course, talking to them, I wanted to say, you know, for a lot of Americans, we don't hate Muslims. We're friends with a lot of Muslims, but from what they were seeing on television, from what they were hearing from their own news sources, it was sometimes a hard sell.
All right, many thanks. And so you're anxious
Yes.
when it comes to that. All right. Well, hopefully it will all be all right. I want to thank you so much, Sarah Rupert, for joining us. Let's get an update now from another location, and that is Phoenix, Arizona, where it's not only a state that usually votes Republican, but there are 2 Senate seats up for grabs. France 24 correspondent Elisa Caverly is there. Elisa, what's the latest where you are?
We are having a party here in Arizona, Francois. There's music on one side of me. They are giving away hot meals on the other. An organization called Feed the Polls is here, and there is a DJ playing music. The stream is steady. About at 6 a.m. this morning, there was a big line outside this polling location behind me, and now it's quieted down a little bit, but there is a steady stream of people going in to vote, and they have been all morning. But really, it's festive. There isn't really anything. There's no tension. There isn't anything that we need to be concerned about here at this particular polling station, where in Arizona there are 11 electoral votes up for grabs. As you had mentioned, Arizona is very much a Republican-leaning state, but this year we are watching Arizona closely because There is a Senate seat up for grabs, and the favorite is Mark Kelly, who is a Democrat, and for the first time in over 50 years, Arizona could have 2 Democrats in those Senate seats. So this is a big year here in Arizona. 4.2 million people here are registered to vote, and already more than 2.5 million have voted. So that's about 55% of the possible votes at this point. So it is a steady stream, not a ton of people here right now, but we'll keep you updated throughout the day.
All right, so Arizona could potentially flip, but again, we'll see. They're still voting at this point. Another state, we never thought we'd be talking about this. Texas, Alisa. Could Texas really be in play?
It really could be. I mean, Texas has always been on the watch list. Every single election year, we are watching Texas because it is so split. It is considered a purple state because it is not quite considered completely red and not quite completely blue. It usually does end up going red or Republican every election year, but every year we watch Texas because there is a possibility that it could turn blue. Now, there was a bit of a controversy in Texas just a few days before the election. 127,000 ballots. Republicans were trying to throw those out because they were saying that drive-through voting was not allowed in Harris County, which includes Houston, Texas, which is a very big Democratic hub in Texas. So this was a big win for Democrats. They threw out that lawsuit. Those votes will be counted. And that's a big win for Biden. So again, it remains to be seen in Texas what they will decide, but this is always one that we are watching every single election year to see which way they go.
Alisa Caverly reporting live from Phoenix, Arizona, and we're pleased to welcome at this point Stuart Patrick, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations think tank. Nice to see you. You visited us in Paris.
It's great to be back on
Thanks for
France
welcoming
24.
us. Thanks for welcoming us. So, you posted a piece that was on the World Politics Review website talking about how the pandemic has so much changed America and changed the course of the election campaign. So let me begin with a what-if question. What if there hadn't been a pandemic? Would we be seeing the same fault lines and the same probabilities when it comes to the outcome on this day?
It's a great question, Francois. I think that you actually would have Donald Trump in a far better position than he is today. I think the fault lines would exist. They would be quite dramatic still, but in early March, the president was still, I think, on his way to be coasting, or not coasting, but probably being the favorite for this election. The economy had been quite strong. Even though his approval ratings had never been above 47%, and that still remains the case. Never happened before in presidential history. But it would have been tough for Joe Biden to make the same sort of case of Trump's incompetence that he's obviously able to make now.
That he's able to make now, you say, it's not always about the economy, as Bill Clinton once famously said, though, is it? Especially because we've had 4 years of constant outrage.
Total. Yeah.
It's a bit exhausting, isn't it?
No, it is. I mean, you have a country right now that is divided, highly partisanly divided. It's exhausted. It's frightened. It's in this interminable pandemic that is not going away. And I think that Donald Trump has actually managed to sort of claw back unemployment, or at least the economy has, to only 8 million unemployed. And I think under normal circumstances, the voters would be giving him credit, but the president is such a he was a chaos candidate, as was said during 2016, and he's been a chaotic president. And I think that even some of the folks who voted for him last time, the swing voters, are beginning to have second thoughts about whether or not they actually can endure another 4 years of this president. And the pandemic is real, and we have had so many infections and deaths in this country.
So many infections and deaths. Would Joe Biden have fared any better?
I think he would have, actually. We recently did a task force report at the Council on Foreign Relations on basically looking at lessons of COVID-19, and there were playbooks in terms of dealing with the COVID-19. It was predicted by all sorts of public health professionals, national intelligence people, that we were going to face an airborne respiratory virus, either coronavirus or a pandemic influenza. And the president, while he closed off U.S. borders, basically dithered for months rather than putting that to good use.
Yeah, because our viewers in West Africa can remember 2015 when there was the Ebola outbreak, and the U.S. sort of led the world then.
It did. It totally mobilized. It actually helped create something called the African Centers for Disease Control, the African CDC. And that, it turns out, has been one of the great successes in why the continent of sub-Saharan Africa, which you think of as sort of relatively speaking technologically not as advanced, has actually, using tried and true methods of global public health, has actually stopped the virus in its tracks in many countries, whereas it's the countries of the wealthy world that are often reeling, and that's particularly the case for the United States because of the failure to implement some of the plans that the Obama administration and its predecessors had laid
down, and now it's a question again, always in America, there's this sort of, how should I say it, conflicted view of how people see the role of government. And in this pandemic, it's the same thing with those who want there to be edicts saying wear the mask all the time, regarding social distancing, et cetera. And others saying, no, it's got to be state by state, county by county, whatever.
Very much so. I mean, what you have is a real dilemma and debate about what should be the role of public authority in crises. And particularly in a pandemic, you really can't have a laissez-faire attitude towards national health. Health security is ultimately, particularly during pandemics, has to be more of a responsibility of the federal government. What we saw in the pandemic, partly because Trump administration just basically said, left everything to the states, you had sort of a caricature of what the Articles of Confederation, basically, where you had 50 different states all going their own ways.
So you have a health crisis, you also have a political crisis. We were at a polling station this morning where there were observers from the Organization of American States, representative from Colombia who was there. Is there a constitutional crisis brewing?
There is the possibility of a constitutional crisis. There certainly are all of the ingredients for it. You have two sides that are so polarized, and consider this an existential moment for the American Republic, who have different visions of reality and who regard a victory by the other side as a fundamental threat to the American way of life, whether as throwing out sort of constitutional tradition, which is the criticism of Donald Trump, or sort of creating a new America that's sort of overly progressive and overly big government. And so there's a possibility of a constitutional crisis. The next few days and weeks will test the strength and resilience of American institutions, because this is not going to be decided entirely overnight. Voting will continue, as I'm sure you've discussed, and during that time, Americans will have to be patient, and they will have to try to allow the institutions, the judiciary, the legislative branch, and the executive branch to work this out in a peaceful manner, and not encourage their citizens.
Will Republicans line up behind Donald Trump if he does like he claims, or has hinted that he might question that he might say, oh, that's enough ballot counting, let's just declare a winner?
You know, I think it depends on what appears to be the magnitude. Let's say it's a Joe Biden victory. What appears to be the magnitude of the victory? If there are enough indications that the former vice president is, 5, 6, 7 points ahead, not just in the national vote, but in a lot of these swing states, I think there will be tremendous pressure among the relatively few members of the Republican Party who are committed less to Donald Trump than to sort of the institutions of government to actually press for an early resolution of the crisis that will result, rather than a prolonged constitutional crisis.
So could we hear a concession speech later tonight?
I don't believe we're going to. I think that I don't see the president being temperamentally able to do that. I think that he will continue to fight. He will try some legal battles. I think that the denouement of this is going to happen in the next several days or a week. But I don't see the president actually giving a concession speech tonight.
When you think of how the United States' rating in the world suffered so badly after the 2003 Iraq invasion and then shot up when Barack Obama was elected, can America's star power rebound?
Partially. I think that there will be tremendous skepticism still about the degree to which the United States, even if Joe Biden is elected, and even if he returns, in a sense, to the multilateral fold, the Paris Agreement, a different approach to trade, a more cooperative approach to the pandemic, there will be those still who question if America can be this capricious, If we can execute a 180-degree turn twice in the space of 4 years, is the United States to be trusted? And also, is it as exceptional as we used to think it was? I think those are very difficult questions Americans have to ask themselves right now, but there are certainly questions that some of even our closest foreign partners and allies are asking themselves right now.
All right, it certainly is an exceptional race, that is for certain. Stuart Patrick of the Council on Foreign Relations, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me here.
And our coverage of the elections continues with election night coverage throughout the night, wherever you are. We'll be back tomorrow to see if there is a winner. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of the France 24 debate.